Hi. We're going to talk a little bit about logical fallacies, an important part of understanding how argument works, what kinds of things can harm an argument, what kinds of things you should be looking for when you read one, what kinds of things you should be avoiding when you write one. This is covered in your book on starting on page 78, chapter 7. Uh, Tells us that fallacies are errors in reasoning that occur when one misuses, misunderstands, or just plain misses evidence. A lot of people make errors in reasoning. They happen sometimes quite naturally, sometimes they happen because we want them to happen, but sometimes it happens from ignorance. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is that they tend to hurt an argument, they tend to weaken an argument. The word fallacy comes from the Latin fallacia, which means deceit. So, a way to think about that is to say that a logical fallacy is something that can deceive by avoiding the truth of what is logical or what is correct. It doesn't necessarily mean people intend to do it as well. Now, there are several kinds of logical fallacies, different ones that you may see in reading and writing. I'm going to talk about a few of them, not a lot, not every one. But I'm going to give you a few of the examples that you're most likely to run into when you read and those you might see when you are writing. And the first and most obvious is what we call the hasty generalization. It is a claim based on a very small amount of evidence or evidence that's not very typical. An example of that might be that if you go into a store and you look for an item and you can't find any help, and then you come to the conclusion that the store doesn't value customer service. It might be that the store was very busy that day, or that you just happened to be there on the day the worst employee happened to be working. Now, if you go several times, that might, and you still don't get any help, that might make a big difference. Okay, stereotyping and sexism are forms of the hasty generalization, where people might make assumptions or decide based on their very limited experience with a group that everybody that's in that group reacts a particular way, like assuming that all women are emotional or all men are cold and over logical, perhaps. Another common fallacy is what is called the ad hominem fallacy. That's a Latin term that means to the man. It's a personal attack on the opponent that draws away from the issue under consideration, we're told. Essentially, instead of attacking the person's position, one attacks the person herself or himself. A similar fallacy, very much like the ad hominem, is a guilt by association. You decide that if somebody is in a particular group, that person holds all the philosophies of that particular group and is therefore a particular kind of person. You know, politicians love to use these. They decide that every Democrat thinks this or every Republican thinks that, and that tends to try to make it look like, well, their position is much better because they're obviously not this, whatever this horrible, terrible thing is. The bandwagon fallacy is one popular with teenagers. That you might think of it as the everybody's doing it fallacy. The Latin term is ad populum, to the people. It means that because other people believe that something is true, that it must therefore be true, which of course is not logical at all. An example of that is that a number of people believe that the Bible says the Lord helps those who help themselves, but there is no translation, no verse in the Bible, nowhere does it actually say that in the Bible. That actually comes from another place. An appeal to tradition is kind of like a bandwagon fallacy in that it tries to convince people that because you've always done it a particular way means that it should be done a particular way. Several years ago, there was an argument over whether a woman should be able to play in the professional golf tour with other men, and several people just said that a woman should not because we haven't had women do it, so therefore we shouldn't do it, which really doesn't make any sense. An appeal to pity is like the bandwagon. It appeals to the idea that we all don't want certain bad things to happen. That starving children, for example, since we all believe that that's a bad thing, appealing to the sense that something would make children starve or make bad things happen. It's really an emotional appeal that appeals only to that sense of it being wrong to starve people, when it may not even be true that that's in effect. Begging the question, you may hear that from time to time. It's also called circular reasoning, and I like that term a lot because it essentially means that things are going round and round in circles. What happens is that the writer has, instead of developing her idea or his idea in a particular way, with lots of details and lots of good reasoning, has really just restated the thesis in different words. It is because it is. Another common fallacy among politicians and among advertisers, you can find lots of logical fallacies in advertising and in political rhetoric, is called equivocation. And what equivocation is the deliberate use of a word or a phrase that would mean something in particular, that means something vague. It's a very vague phrase, but people may have a particular association with it, oftentimes an emotional association with it, so that the reader is swayed by the association of the word than what the word actually may mean. For example, our little picture here, we have a guy who says, "If you love freedom, vote for me." I actually saw this on a bumper sticker a few years ago. It said, "Vote freedom, vote," and then the name of the candidate. And the implication was that the other side was against your personal freedoms, whatever you mean by freedom itself. That somebody was out to harm your particular freedoms. Another common use of the equivocation fallacy is to call something pornographic or dirty or something like that, when a lot of those words are kind of in the eye of the beholder. Okay? Out of context is something that happens when words or phrases are distorted from their original source. The source may say something and mean one thing. However, the writer has determined to make it look like it means something completely opposite. Example of this I saw several years ago, where a politician had stated that there were noticed that there were a lot of very poor teachers, and he said that the poor teachers, the bad teachers, should not get raises. And the other politician said, well, he's against raises for teachers, which wasn't at all what the first person had said. It's what he took from that, which wasn't true at all. Another common fallacy is the slippery slope. You'll see this an awful lot in arguments. Um, it is essentially the assumption that if one thing happens, uh, inevitably another bad thing is going to happen. In a way, it's funny to look at, for example, debates on gun control that use usually both sides oftentimes employ a slippery slope reasoning that well, one side will say, well, if we pass this bill on allowing guns to be out, that we will have all these vigilantes in the streets and they will be shooting people every time they get a little upset. Uh, then, on the other hand, the other side will say, well, if we don't allow you to have this particular gun or this particular weapon, allow everyone to have it, then inevitably only only criminals will have guns, and then they're going to come into your house and they're going to rape people and they're going to kill people and they're going to steal everything that you own. Um, trying to portray this completely horrible ending, no matter which side. So you can see that both sides of any argument can use the same fallacies and poorly put that into what they do. An analogy is actually, I've said this before, is a very good way to help readers to understand. It's a special kind of comparison where what we oftentimes will do is to take something that is very, very complicated and make a comparison to something that's very easy to understand, and that helps the reader to understand the complicated thing. But sometimes we use analogies poorly, and if we create what we call a false analogy, then we don't have something that is logical. What that means is, what a false analogy is the approach that because two things are very much alike, that they're alike in all the important ways. An example is that if someone is a good student, that person will be a very good teacher. We have, I'm sure, lots of examples of teachers who are not really very, very good at their jobs, but who were excellent students. I guess if you want to bring back equivocation, very much trying to figure out what do we mean by a good student. Another common way to look at this is, I see this all the time with sports, where someone will say, well, we're going to have a winning season because we're going to do these other things in the past, like somebody else did in the past, a famous coach or a famous athlete did, not realizing that the person that's in the present doesn't have all the resources or can't do everything that first person did. The false cause is one of my favorites, not in a real sense, but in the sense that I see it an awful lot in arguments. It shows up in lots of student papers. It's definitely very faulty reasoning. It is the assumption that because one event happens and then a second, that the second was caused by the first event. In Latin, it's called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which literally means after this, therefore because of this. So, for example, a person goes out to eat and then gets sick a little bit later, they might blame the restaurant where they ate and assume that what they ate happened because of the restaurant, when the restaurant may not be at fault at all. It could be a number of other things that could be in play. Okay? Oversimplification is very similar to the false cause. It kind of is the same thing in the opposite way. It's the assumption that a single cause or solution is appropriate for a complex problem. It takes the false cause and reverses it. For instance, if we say, well, if we just pay teachers more, then we'll suddenly have better teachers. That might cause more teachers that are good to go into the business, but it also might do some other things. There may be other reasons why some teachers are not as good as others. Another very common fallacy is the either or fallacy. It's also called the false dilemma. I like that phrasing because basically what this does is present two alternatives to a problem when there may be several that exist. So we may say, well, if we don't pass this law, then several people will starve. It's got to be one way or the other. Either they're this thing or they're that thing. And one way to do that is to do what we call card stacking, where someone makes one side look a whole lot better than another side. They maybe even ignore the opposite side. A straw man argument does that. It was a phrase used for a lot of the either or arguments because, in the literal sense, a straw person would be easy to knock down. And usually, what happens is that the writer has presented one position so in such an absurd light, in such a wrong and poor light, that it makes the other position therefore look a lot better, even if it's not. Remember that a lot of logical fallacies happen because they seem to make sense on the surface. They're not things that people ought to do. I should tell a little story that I had a student one time who thanked me after talking in class about logical fallacies because he thought that would mean he'd win an argument with his girlfriend. And I thought, well, how is that going to help you? And he thought, well, he's going to use the wrong thinking. Well, that's not what I want you to do. I don't want you to do these things. I want you to learn how to avoid these things. You shouldn't look for errors everywhere you go. Some errors are a matter of a particular circumstance where it looks wrong in one place and not in another. A lot of them come from ignorance. But the most important thing you should probably pay attention to is that logical fallacies will always hurt your argument. The person who buys the logical fallacy is either the person who already agrees with you, thinks that your side is right, and therefore can't see the other positions, or someone who's easily swayed by things that are not particularly logical. So these are things you want to avoid in your writing, but they're also things that if you see them in other writing, it's a way of seeing where an argument may have flaws.